In this first video, we'll talk about interactional sociolinguistics. So let's first look at the concepts that make up the term interactional sociolinguistics. First, we have interaction analysis. Now, this is similar to what we've already discussed about conversation analysis, where we examine language and use to understand how people jointly construct meanings of interactions and jointly perform actions through talk. Interaction analysis involves analyzing naturally occurring interaction, for example, everyday conversations or institutional talk like doctor-patient conversations or business interactions. And analysis is situated, which means we analyze talk in a context. However, across the different approaches in interaction analysis, there are differing definitions of context, whether it's very limited to what is happening in the talk or whether factors beyond the talk are considered in the analysis. Secondly, we have sociolinguistics. So you may already know that the concern with sociolinguistics is looking at linguistic features used in particular contexts or situations, where we also consider factors such as age, sex, education, occupation, ethnic group membership, and other peer group identifications. And the analyst would include these factors in terms of how they influence choice of sounds, grammar, and vocabulary in the language use. Let's look at some of the influences of IS as you would have read in the Gumpers chapter. Firstly, ethnomethodology is a key influence of interactional sociolinguistics in that analysts go into the field, observe and analyze naturally occurring talk, interact with participants, and collect multiple types of data. Here, Garfinkel's work has been particularly relevant. Interactional sociolinguistics is also influenced by CA and sociology in its focus on talk and naturally occurring conversations and how interaction unfolds in context. So many concepts from CA such as turn-taking, adjacency pairs, etc. are part of the analytical focus in interactional sociolinguistics. In addition to the work of CA scholars such as Sachs, Goffman's sociological work has been highly influential in IS, where many Goffmanian concepts such as face, framing, and the idea of an interaction order are reflected in the analysis. Of course, as an approach that comes out of linguistics, sociolinguistics is a key influence in IS in that participant factors such as cultural or ethnic identities can be included in the analysis. Another influential area has been work in the field of pragmatics, work of scholars such as Delheim's ethnography of speaking and Grice's conversational implicatures are of key significance. You can read more about the theories and concepts of some of these scholars in Anger Miller's Discourse Reader. In general, IS is a discourse analytic approach within the broader area of linguistic ethnography. You may also see some describe it as being part of linguistic anthropology. So these categorizations of anthropology and ethnography reflect the sociological and often culturally situated analysis that is performed in IS studies, where aspects such as intercultural communication, cultural differences, code switching, and such are studied. The main focus in IS is on how people use language in face-to-face interaction, and we specifically focus on how people manage social identities and social activities as they interact. Compass mentions diversity as a central theme in IS, and he distinguishes between two ways of viewing diversity. Firstly, the post or the structuralist perspective of diversity, where diversity of interaction is seen as a product of macrostructures of political and economic forces and power. This is resembles what you might see within a CDA approach, where we're taking a top-down view of society and how things are structured from larger macro structures which influence the micro practices such as discourse. On the other hand, we have the constructivist view of things, which takes a bottom-up approach and starts with a micro and takes the view of the view that since social worlds are shaped from the bottom up through interaction, we should begin looking at diversity by focusing on localized action. For example, in the context of conversation analysis. IS, on the other hand, is seen as a bridge between the gap between these two perspectives. So IS seeks to bridge the gap and focuses on communicative practice as the everyday world site where societal and interactive forces merge. So although the IS analysis also looks at the localized interactional practices, it also brings broader and macro issues and macro elements of the context into the analysis. Let's look at some of the main concerns in interactional sociolinguistics. First, the interpretive process through which interactional outcomes are achieved is a key concern. This means analysis considers how people interpret interaction in order to achieve certain interactional outcomes, for example, a doctor-patient consultation, a job interview, and daily social interactions. Our interpretive assessments of other speakers talk are not just based on what is happening as we speak, but it's also built on our context-specific background knowledge. For example, in a doctor-patient consultation, I have certain background knowledge about what is expected in this type of interaction and what I'm supposed to do and how I can interpret the other person or the doctor's talk. Now, this focus on interpretation is grounded in the view in IS that talk is not detailed enough to convey real intentions. In the IS perspective, there are gaps in our actual spoken interaction, and interactants rely on practical reasoning and unstated, taken for granted background knowledge to fill in the gaps of what is unsaid. For example, based on my background knowledge, I know that when a doctor says, "How are you?" at the beginning of my medical checkup for a chronic condition, I know that the doctor, or I would interpret it as the doctor is asking about my specific medical condition, not for a general update on how I feel. In another context, maybe when your colleague says, "How are you?" as you pass them in the hall, you would probably interpret this as a greeting which doesn't really require a complete answer about how you really feel. So you might just respond with "fine" and "you," even though you may not be feeling so great. So we rely on all these unstated elements, and we use our existing background knowledge of our previous interactions in order to help us interpret what is said and decide how to respond. In the IS view, the interpretive assessments interactants make display a built-in, deeply internalized, and mostly unverbalized sense of social order. So we can examine this abstract notion of social order by examining the interpretive assessments that interactants make, and how can we view that by looking at their interactions. In this view, sequential analysis is not considered enough to examine situated interpretation. So a CA analysis which is limited to the interactional behavior is seen as just one aspect of analyzing talk. Interactional practices are considered just one of the many ways that we signal meaning. In other words, sequential interaction is just one of various indexical processes that affect inferencing. Taking the example given earlier, interactionally, "How are you?" is a question that designs a responding next turn. It's an open question. So in the IS view, there are broader contextual elements beyond the first pair part that have implications on how the next speaker interprets and responds to the turn. And within interactional sociolinguistics, you can include these elements in your analysis. So the focus on IS is to determine what is meant and how interactants' interpretive assessments relate to the linguistic signaling processes. So what linguistic devices, discursive devices, interactional devices play a role in the signaling process that can help us interpret talk. To sum up the previous slide, interactional sociolinguistics focuses on conversational inference, and the key concern is the interpretive procedure. This is what interactants rely on. It involves the assessment of what is intended in a particular turn of talk at any point in the exchange, and they rely on this to plan and produce their responses and achieve a particular interactional outcome. Gumpers mentions five major trajectories in IS research. Firstly, intercultural communication. Now, when you consider that the focus is on interpretive procedures, intercultural communication is an interesting focus because the interactants may have differing understandings and background knowledge. Also, linked is code switching. Um, Language, power, and institutions. Another trajectory is research looking at language and gender. And then finally, there are studies that look at discursive identities and how they're constructed in interaction. These are the steps that Gumpers lists in doing IS. The first stage is doing ethnographic research. So the analyst goes into the field to understand the local context and identify recurring interaction types. So what are the particular types of interaction you can observe and record that are relevant to the research problem? At this stage, the analyst will also engage with participants to understand members' problems, expectations, and practices, and this will help the analyst to understand the participants' interpretive assessments and background knowledge. The next step is to select events that are representative sets of interaction for analysis. So which particular interactional events are typical for the interaction in the context that's being studied. After that, the analyst would scan or skim through the recordings to get a better understanding of the data. First, in terms of the content, what is being done and talked about, and secondly, in terms of linguistic features, including pronunciation and prosody. The focus at this stage is to isolate sequentially bounded units that are marked off from other units by thematic coherence and by beginnings and endings. This refers to identifying overall sequential structures or phases. Scanning the recordings also enables the analyst to discover certain parts of the interaction that either confirm or reject the preliminary analytical interpretations and assumptions. As IS research works a lot with spoken data, transcription is also part of doing interactional sociolinguistics. So an analyst doesn't necessarily have to use Jefferson notation, but the transcript will indicate significant verbal and nonverbal signs such as prosody, paralinguistic markers, and so on. Transcribing the data also aids the analyst in identifying recurrent patterns in form or context relationship, where particular forms or linguistic features are recurringly used in particular contexts. When you analyze the transcript, you can also compare across events in your data set, and this will allow the analyst to yield hypotheses about certain contextualization practices. In the extra reading, Ben Rampton lists four broad categories of analytic resources that we can draw on when doing interactional sociolinguistics. Firstly, the areas of linguistics and discourse analysis give us concepts and terms and ways to understand the linguistic resources that participants draw on in communication. Secondly is the area of sociology, where we can draw on a lot of the Goffmanian concepts such as framing, or conversation analytic research and concepts, and these give us frameworks and procedures for investigating situated encounters, whether we're looking at the ongoing sequential construction or we're going a little bit beyond that to look at rituals and moral accountabilities in semiotic forms and strategies. The third analytic resource in IS is ethnography. Rampton quotes Delheim's statement about having 2 feet on the ground and 1 eye on the horizon. So this reflects the analytical position where you are in the field, you are looking at the local context, but you're also looking slightly beyond that, beyond the encounter at hand, to see what broader social structures and social order is reflected in the local interaction, and how this encounter fits into longer and broader biographies, larger institutions and histories, as well as a sense of the cultural and personal perspectives and experiences that participants bring to the interaction, and take from them. The fourth analytic resource in interactional sociolinguistics is other public and academic discourses. So although we might be looking at a particular type of interaction, there are broader institutional and academic discourses on maybe not exactly the area that you're studying, but a broader picture of the environment in which the study is cited. So we need to look beyond the immediate context to consider other research that might be of relevance to the context that we're studying. So some concepts in IS, first of all, genre. Genre is relevant to IS because our schemata or frames or presuppositions that we have about a specific event, of course, has implications on the inferential assessments that we make when we are experiencing an event of a particular genre, for example, in a doctor-patient consultation or in legal discourse or academic discourse or perhaps a YouTube unboxing video. These are all certain genres, and our experiences and expectations of the genre will influence how we interpret actions within it, which also in turn influences our own actions and interactions. Inference, of course, is very important in IS, and the idea of an interpretive repertoire. So these are the resources that a member has. All of us have these certain resources that we use and we draw on when we need to interpret meaning and understand interactions. Indexicality refers to signaling meaning. So what are the different resources that we use to index or to refer to something in order to convey meaning? So you can read further in the course readings to find out more about indexicality, and this is a very important concept in discourse analysis in general. We also have the idea of contextualization cues, which refers to any verbal sign which, when processed in occurrence with some sort of grammatical and lexical signs, serves to provide a contextual ground for interpretation. So these can be different types of cues, whether they are in terms of prosody, in terms of intonation, in terms of volume, that help signal and indicate a particular context. Finally, we have activity type. So activity types refer to a culturally recognized understanding of that this is a particular type of activity. For example, inviting someone, a job interview. These are all ways that we categorize particular communicative encounters so that we can understand them. And this idea of activity type is categorizing encounters based on their communicative goals. So let's look at a couple of examples of research that uses interactional sociolinguistics. While we typically expect IS studies to be concerned with naturally occurring spoken data, researchers have used IS in various contexts. And this paper is an example of a study that uses interactional sociolinguistics as a way to inform the design of chatbots and the prompt response turns that the chatbot provides in engaging with a human. And one data extract and the analysis is presented on this slide, which looks at how the bot elicits information through a series of questions, but displays its incompetence by inappropriately aligning the next sequence. You can read more about this paper if you find this type of study interesting. So this study uses spoken interaction and it looks at how communicative challenges and interactional dilemmas are managed between native speakers and non-native speakers of English. So in this study, even though it's looking at spoken discourse, the interactions were not typically naturally occurring conversations, but the researchers arranged these conversations between native speakers and non-native speaker pairs. This is intercultural type of setting is quite a common setting for interactional social linguistic studies. And the data extract that's shown on the screen looks at how NSS non-native speakers repairs accomplish a sort of interpersonal distancing. This study has an interesting context. It's looking at how people eat collaboratively in mukbang and how this is done in multimodal ways online. So we have the person who's hosting the mukbang who's there in video, but we also have the responders or the viewers who are performing actions and telling the person what to eat, but they're doing it via text. And this is happening simultaneously or synchronously. The data shown on this slide looks at how the two types of recruitment, that the viewer who is recruiting the action from the person who is hosting the mukbang, and what are the ways in which the viewers get the host to actually eat particular types of food. So now we've talked about a little bit about IS and you've had a general introduction to it. Here's a self-learning activity for you to do. Look at the required reading by Gumpers, the chapter by Gumpers, and we're going to focus on one particular extract, but it would help if you read the whole chapter. But for this self-learning activity, we're focusing on extract 4, which is taken from a job interview, and look at the extract as well as read Gumper's analysis of this extract and answer these 3 questions. This is the data extract for the self-learning activity. You'll find it in Gumper's on page 320. We've come to the end of our short video on interactional social linguistics. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat below the video or bring them to the session the next time we meet.